This is Aeon history. Tonight, a chapter from 24 Hours in Ancient Rome, what daily life was really like for the common citizen. Settle in. The light is low. The hour is long. Before the sky above the 7 hills had turned from indigo to the slow gray of a Roman dawn, a baker on the Vicus Tuscus was already pressing his palms into a slab of dough still warm from the previous night's leavening. The air in his narrow workshop smelled of yeast, of olive oil sweating from clay jars, of wood smoke that had never fully left the brick of the oven's mouth. Outside in the lane beyond his door, a single dog trotted past on 3 legs and a wet nose, and somewhere above the rooftops a rooster cried out from a courtyard garden tucked behind the high blank wall of an insula. The baker did not look up. His hands were busy, and the city in its vast, restless body was beginning to stir. This was the hour the Romans called the prima fax, the first torch, though by the late Republic and early Empire the common citizen, lacking the leisure of the wealthy, simply called it the time before light. Across the city, in the warren of tenement blocks that crowded the Subura and the Aventine, the laboring poor were rising in the dimness of single rooms, gathering tunics from wooden pegs, splashing cold water from earthen basins onto faces still creased with the prints of straw mattresses. We believe, from the wax tablets and graffiti recovered at Pompeii and Herculaneum, that ordinary Romans rose with the sun in summer and well before it in winter, beginning the day not with a meal, but with a brief private prayer at the household shrine, the lararium, where small bronze figures of the family's guardian spirits stood watch over a shelf of offerings. The poet Martial, writing in the 1st century after Christ, complained more than once of being woken before dawn by the noise of bakers, schoolmasters, and the brass-pounding coppersmiths of his neighborhood. His grumbling is, for us, a gift. It tells us that Rome was a city of overlapping sounds long before the proper day began, that the lower classes were already at work while their patrons still slept beneath embroidered coverlets. The professions of the night ran headlong into the professions of the morning, and somewhere in the seam between them the common citizen began his hours. A water carrier shouldered a wooden yoke and started down toward one of the 9 great aqueduct-fed fountains that the urban prefect's office maintained for public use. A wool worker unwound the long combings she had set out the evening before to dry and tied them with twine for the loom. A vegetable seller, who had walked in from the Campagna under a moon now sinking westward, was setting up his trestle at the edge of the Forum Holatorium, the herb and produce market that crouched in the shadow of the Capitoline Hill. The dwellings these people returned to at night were not, for most, the spacious atrium houses of literary imagination. The vast majority of Rome's population, perhaps as many as 9 in 10 of the city's roughly 1 million inhabitants at its imperial height, lived in apartment blocks called Insulae, some of which the archaeology at Ostia preserves to a height of 3 and 4 stories. The poorest rooms were on the upper floors, where stairs were steepest, water hardest to fetch, and the threat of fire most acute. Juvenal, in his bitter 3rd satire, wrote of the man who must climb to a garret beneath the very tiles, with nothing but a single mattress, a stained coverlet, and a few cracked cups to call his own. The evidence suggests this was not poetic exaggeration, but the lived reality of thousands. A common Roman often woke with the smell of his neighbor's cooking smoke still clinging to the wooden beams above his head, and stepped from his sleeping room directly onto a balcony or shared landing where the chamber pot of the night had been emptied, sometimes, to the perpetual fury of magistrates, straight into the street below. By the time the first true rays of sun struck the gilded statues atop the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline, the city was already exhaling. The great wooden shutters of the tabernae, the small shops and workshops that opened directly onto the street through wide front arches, were being swung up and hooked into place. Bronze hinges sang in their sockets. Dust drifted in slow ribbons through the slanted light. In the lanes around the Forum Boreum, the cattle market, men in short brown tunics were already herding sheep and goats through narrow streets toward the slaughtering platforms near the Tiber, and the long, low bleating of the animals competed with the rhythmic shouts of drovers calling their counts. There was no silence anywhere in Rome at this hour. There was only the shifting weight of sound, moving from the rooftops down into the streets, as the city's hundreds of thousands of mouths began at last to speak. For the freeborn citizen who held the status of cleans, a client bound by ties of mutual obligation to a wealthier patron, the first task of the day was the Salutatio, the formal morning greeting. We know from the letters of Pliny the Younger and from Martial's epigrams that this ritual could be exhausting, undignified, and sometimes humiliating, yet it remained the principal hinge of the Roman social world. Dressed in the heavy white wool of the toga, which alone marked him as a citizen, the client made his way through still-cool streets toward his patron's house, often arriving in the company of dozens of other clients who knocked at the same door. There they waited in the vestibule, ushered in by the nomenclator, a slave whose entire trade was the memorizing of names and faces. The patron, seated in his atrium, received each in turn, sometimes with a brief word, sometimes with a small basket of food or coin called the Sportula, a few sesterces, perhaps, just enough to buy the day's bread and oil. The Sportula was, by the time of the Flavian emperors, formalized at 6¼ sesterces, a sum modest enough that Martial composed entire poems mocking its inadequacy. He writes of clients trailing across the city through rain and mud for the sake of this small payment, of the toga ruined by spattered filth, of the long walk home with a basket no heavier than the dignity it had cost. Yet for many ordinary citizens, the Sportula was the difference between a day with food and a day without. The system bound the city together in invisible threads of obligation, and the common Roman, however poor, learned to navigate it from boyhood, knowing which doors to knock at, which patrons paid promptly, which steward must be greeted by name and which by silence. For those without a patron, and there were many, the morning held different obligations. The laborer who worked stone in one of the great public building yards near the Forum of Trajan needed to be at his bench before the foreman called the roll. The fuller, who cleansed wool and cloth by stamping it in vats of stale urine collected in jars at every street corner, opened the doors of his workshop early to take advantage of the morning light. The shoemaker, the bronzesmith, the maker of lamps in red clay, the dyer whose hands were stained for life with the dull green of woad or the deep maroon of madder, all of these had their tools laid out by the time the sun cleared the city wall, and all of them worked, when work was to be had, until the 7th hour of the day, which fell somewhere near our 1 in the afternoon. The first meal, the intaculum, was, for most common Romans, a small and hurried affair. A piece of bread, often dipped in wine to soften it, a few olives from the household jar, perhaps a smear of cheese or honey if the household could afford such things. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, mentions the simple cheeses of the Apennines as the food of working folk, and we have inscriptions from Pompeii that list the prices of cheese, garlic, and salt fish in amounts so small they can only have been daily purchases for daily consumption. There was no leisurely breakfast for the laboring class. They ate standing in their doorways or walking, or at the small wooden counters of the thermopolia, the hot food shops whose marble counters, pierced with circular holes for sunken pots, survive at Pompeii in such numbers that we may count more than 150 within the small excavated area. The smell of these counters in the morning was the smell of warm chickpea stew, of lentils boiled with onion, of fish broth thickened with stale bread, and of cheap wine cut with hot water. By the 2nd hour after sunrise, the streets were impassable in many quarters. Julius Caesar, in his sweeping legislation on the city, had banned wheeled traffic from the center during daylight hours, which meant that the predawn had been a thunder of carts, and the day became a sea of feet. Pedestrians moved shoulder to shoulder along the raised pavements that ran beside each thoroughfare, stepping carefully across the great basalt stones laid into the road at crossings, so that one might pass without setting foot in the filth of the gutter. We learned from Juvenal that to walk in Rome was to be jostled, elbowed, splashed, and trodden upon by men carrying baskets of fish, by litter-bearers in matched livery, by slaves shouldering amphorae of oil, by soldiers in scuffed leather, and by school children weaving past their masters. The litigants of the courts, the bankers of the forum, the matrons going to market with a single slave behind them, all moved together through the slow churn of the morning streets. The smells of these streets are difficult for us to imagine now, but the sources are unsparing. There was the sharp ammonia tang of the fuller's urine jars set at every corner. There was the wet meat smell of the macella, the meat markets, where carcasses hung from hooks beneath shaded awnings. There was the perfume of the ungentarii, who blended saffron and rose and frankincense into oils for the wealthy, their stalls breathing sweetness into the otherwise grimy air. There was the wood smoke of 1,000 braziers, the resin of pine torches, the dung of mules, the salt of fish brined in pottery vats, and beneath it all the slow, muddy breath of the Tiber as it carried away the city's waste through the great stone arches of the Cloaca Maxima. An engineering marvel begun, by tradition, in the time of the Tarquin kings, and still functioning when Augustus inspected it personally in the 1st century before Christ. The Forum Romanum at mid-morning was the beating heart of public life, and the common citizen had reason to enter it nearly every day. Here were the basilicas where the praetors' tribunals heard cases. Here were the money changers' tables, where a man might exchange a worn provincial denarius for the sharper stamped coins of the imperial mint. Here were the long, covered colonnades where men of business stood in clusters, talking in the rapid Latin of contracts and ledgers. A petitioner in a borrowed toga waited for the patron whose case he was supporting. A baker arrived to register the price of his loaves with the aedile's clerk. A freed slave came to record the manumission paper that made his son freeborn at last. The Forum was a place of paperwork and prayer, of gossip and oratory, and the common Roman moved through it with a familiarity that the surviving silence of its ruins can scarcely suggest. Children of the laboring classes had their own routines. We know from the writings of Quintilian, who composed the most thorough surviving treatise on Roman education in the late 1st century, that schooling for ordinary boys and girls, and it did include girls, at least at the primary level, began at about the age of 7. The ludus literarius, the elementary school, was often held in a corner of the Forum itself, or in a small rented room with the master's stool set against the wall, and the children seated on benches with wax tablets across their knees. The master, the literator, was poorly paid, often a freedman of Greek origin, and Martial preserves the image of him roaring his lessons over the noise of the surrounding streets long before the rest of the city had finished its breakfast. The boys learned letters by tracing them with a stylus into wax. They learned arithmetic by counting on the abacus and on their fingers, the Roman finger reckoning being a system of remarkable precision. They learned to read aloud from passages of Virgil or from the simpler verses of Livius Andronicus, an early translator of Homer whose works were standard schoolroom fare for centuries after his death. Discipline in these schools was severe by our standards. Horace remembered with bitterness his own master, Orbilius, whom he called Plagasus, the flogger, and the cane and the leather strap were instruments as common as the stylus. Yet many children of common families came through this education with at least the ability to read a public notice, to sign a contract, and to calculate the price of a basket of grain. The wax tablet graffiti of Pompeii, with their alphabets scratched repeatedly by clumsy hands, suggest a literacy more widespread than is often assumed. A baker's son who could read the price boards above his father's counter, a shopkeeper's daughter who could keep the day's accounts in chalk on a wooden slate. These were not exceptional but ordinary figures of the imperial city. As the morning gave way to noon, the rhythm of Rome shifted again. The 5th and 6th hours of the day were a time of slowing, and the laboring man who had risen in darkness now began to think of the prandium, the midday meal. This was a simple repast, generally taken cold and standing, bread again perhaps with a smear of olive paste, cold cuts of meat if the household had cooked the night before, raw vegetables such as cucumber, leeks, or radish, and a cup of wine watered to half its strength. The well-known practice of the Romans was to dilute their wine, often 2 parts water to 1 of wine, sometimes 3 to 1, and to drink unmixed wine in the daytime was considered a mark of intemperance. The laboring poor often took this meal at their workbenches, the more leisured at small tables in the courtyards of their insulae, the wealthy in their dining rooms or gardens, and the urban prefect, no doubt, somewhere among the dignitaries who lingered at the basilicas of the Forum. After the prandium came the great social hinge of the Roman day, the bath. We must understand the baths not as a luxury, but as a fundamental civic ritual, woven so deeply into the life of every citizen that the loss of the local bathhouse was felt as a kind of municipal grief. By the High Empire, Rome contained more than 800 bathing establishments, ranging from the colossal imperial thermae of Caracalla, Diocletian, and Trajan, which could accommodate thousands of bathers at a single hour, down to the modest neighborhood balnea that served the streets of the Subura and the Aventine for a single copper coin. The poet Seneca, who lived above a bathhouse and complained of it bitterly in his 76th moral letter, has left us the most vivid description we possess of what one heard from such a building. The grunts of men exercising with leaden weights, the slap of palms on oiled skin during massage, the shrieks of the pickpocket caught in the changing room, the high reedy cry of the sausage seller wandering the courtyards with his tray. Beneath all of this, Seneca wrote, ran the constant slap and gurgle of water moving through pipes and pools. For the common citizen, the visit to the baths followed a generally accepted sequence. He entered the apoditerium, the changing room, and stripped to a small loincloth, or more often, to nothing at all, for Roman bathing was generally naked, and any modesty about the body that we might project onto the past would have been incomprehensible to him. His clothes were placed in a niche along the wall, sometimes watched over by a slave he had brought for the purpose, sometimes left to the doubtful care of the bath attendant. He then progressed through a sequence of rooms heated to increasing temperatures. The tepidarium, gently warm. The caldarium, intensely hot, where steam rose from a great central basin and the marble of the floors burned beneath the soles. And finally the frigidarium, where a cold water plunge closed the pores and braced the body for the rest of the afternoon. Between these passages he might be scraped with a strigil, a curved bronze instrument used to lift oil and sweat from the skin in a single long stroke, or massaged with scented oils brought in small glass vials. The baths were also where the news of the city was traded. Pliny the Younger writes in one of his letters of meeting old friends at the baths and falling into long conversation in the warm rooms. Martial writes of dinner invitations issued at the strigil's edge and accepted with a nod. For the laboring man whose only daily contact with the wider world was the half-hour spent at his neighborhood balneum, the bath was newspaper, marketplace, gossip parlor, and gymnasium all at once. He left it cleaner, sometimes a little richer in information, sometimes a little poorer in coin, and almost always pleasantly tired in the limbs. The bath fell for most Romans in the 8th or 9th hour of the day, somewhere between our 2 and 3 in the afternoon. By then the great sundials in the Campus Martius, the largest of which, dedicated by Augustus and partly excavated beneath the streets of modern Rome, used as its gnomon a pink granite obelisk brought from Heliopolis, were casting long oblique shadows across their marble paving. The laboring day for many trades ended after the bath, though some workshops continued into the late afternoon for special orders. The streets, which had been a sea of upward-moving feet in the morning, now flowed in the other direction, as men and women carried home the small purchases of the late market: a hank of leeks, a fresh-killed pigeon, a clay flask of wine sealed with pitch, a bunch of herbs tied with cord. The principal meal of the Roman day was the cena, the dinner, eaten in the late afternoon and early evening, usually beginning around the 9th hour and lasting, for those who could afford to linger, well into the night. For the wealthy, the cena was an elaborate three-course affair, a procession of small plates carried in by silent slaves and consumed by guests reclining on couches arranged in 3 sides of a U about a low table. For the common citizen of moderate means, the cena was simpler: a single hot dish of pulses or grain, a portion of fish or fowl if the household could afford it, vegetables stewed with oil and herbs, and bread to scoop up the sauce. For the poorest, the cena was a bowl of porridge, the famous pools of which Pliny the Elder writes, a thick mash of emmer wheat or millet boiled with salt and a little olive oil, which had been the staple food of the Roman peasant since the days of the early Republic. We learn much about the food of common Romans from the archaeology of Pompeii and from the carbonized remains of meals interrupted by the eruption of Vesuvius in the year 79 after Christ. The cooks of that city used iron griddles, bronze pans, and small portable braziers of terracotta. They cooked over charcoal rather than wood, for charcoal was cleaner and produced less smoke in the cramped quarters of an Insula kitchen. They flavored their food with garum, the fermented fish sauce whose production sites have been excavated all along the coast of southern Spain, of Portugal, and of North Africa, with vinegar, with honey, with the peppery seeds of cumin and coriander imported through the great spice markets of Alexandria. The common Roman did not eat blandly. He ate within the limits of his purse, with as much enthusiasm for flavor as any cook of any age. Wine was drunk at every meal, including the cena, and was almost always mixed with water. The unmixed wines of Falernum and Sestia, beloved of the wealthy, would have been beyond the reach of the laboring class, but a serviceable provincial wine could be had for a few asses per liter, and the thermopolia and the wine shops of the Subura did a brisk trade in jugs sold to be carried home for the family table. Beer existed, though it was looked upon as a barbarian drink and consumed mostly by soldiers and traders from the northern provinces. Milk was for children and invalids. Water, when not drawn from the public fountains, was carried home in clay jugs and stored in covered vessels. The Romans were keenly aware that water from certain sources caused illness, and the engineering corps of the aqueducts maintained reservoirs and settling tanks specifically to improve the clarity of what came down from the Alban hills. The cena was also, for many common Romans, a social occasion. We have evidence from inscriptions and from the satirical poems of the period that workmen's collegia, the trade guilds of bakers, of carpenters, of dyers, held monthly dinners at which members paid a small subscription and dined together in a rented room or in the precinct of a temple sacred to their patron deity. These were not raucous affairs. They were ordered and ritualized, with libations poured to the guild's tutelary god, with toasts to the emperor and to the household genius of the host. The freed slave who had risen to become a master baker might host a cena for his colleagues that lasted 3 hours and consisted of a soup, a roasted fowl, and a sweet pastry of dates and honey. A feast by the standards of his earlier life, a simple meal by those of the senatorial class, and a profound expression of belonging by every standard he himself would have recognized. As the cena drew toward its end and the lamps were lit, the city moved into its twilight. The hour before darkness held a strange quality in ancient Rome, a brief lull when the day's labor was done, but the night's perils had not yet begun. When the streets thinned of their daytime crowd and the shadows lengthened between the high walls of the Insulae. This was the hour at which the urban prefects' vigils, the city's 7 cohorts of watchmen and firefighters, began their evening rounds. We know a great deal about these men from the archaeology of their barracks at Ostia and from inscriptions naming individual centurions and tribunes. Each cohort was responsible for 2 of the city's 14 districts, and each carried buckets, leather hoses, axes, hooked poles for tearing down burning timbers, and the small lanterns by which they navigated the dim streets after dark. Fire was the perennial nightmare of urban Rome. The insulae were wood-framed for their upper stories, the lamps were fueled by olive oil that easily spilled, and the cooking fires of crowded kitchens were never far from a draft. Tacitus records the great fire of the year 64 after Christ as a calamity that destroyed 3 of the city's 14 districts entirely and damaged 7 more. But there were lesser fires, 2 or 3 serious ones each year on average, that consumed individual blocks and left families homeless in a single night. The common Roman lived with this fear quietly. He kept a bucket of sand near his hearth. He inspected his lamp wicks for stray fibers. He noted the location of the nearest public fountain not only for water in the morning, but for the bucket line he might need to join after dark. The streets of Rome at night were dark in a way our age can barely imagine. There were no street lamps. The light that fell from upper windows was the soft yellow of olive oil lamps within, scarcely enough to illuminate the cobbles below. The moon, when it was full and the sky clear, was the principal source of nocturnal illumination, and on moonless nights or in winter cloud the city became, beyond a few well-frequented squares, almost impenetrable. Wealthy citizens who ventured out after dark, to a dinner party, to a private gathering, traveled with a retinue of slaves carrying pine-pitch torches that smoked and dropped sparks onto the pavement. The common citizen, lacking such an escort, stayed indoors after dark unless his work compelled him to walk. He locked his door with a heavy iron key that hung on a leather thong at his belt. He barred his shutters. He extinguished his lamp before sleep to save oil and to reduce the risk of fire. Yet the night was not entirely silent. Caesar's ban on daytime wheeled traffic meant that the great supply carts of Rome moved only after sunset, and the rumble of iron-shod wheels on stone, the cries of drovers, and the bellowing of oxen filled the streets all through the small hours. Pliny the Elder mentions, with the patience of one long accustomed, that the carts of the night made sleep difficult in any apartment fronting a major road. Juvenal speaks of the same nuisance in his 3rd satire, the perpetual creaking, the shouted curses of a teamster whose mule had balked at a corner, the splintering crash when a load shifted and an amphora burst on the pavement. Above this restless traffic, the upper-floor dweller heard also the snoring of his neighbors, the cry of an infant, the rhythmic creak of a loom worked late by a weaver desperate to finish a commission before morning. For those who could not yet sleep, and the records suggest that the entertainments of Rome stretched well into the night for those with money or longing, there were the wine shops and the popinae, the small dingy taverns that lined the back lanes of every district. The popinae was looked upon with disdain by respectable society. Cicero refers contemptuously to the popinae as the haunts of the lowest classes, and the laws of the early emperors at various times forbade them from serving hot food on the theory that this would encourage idleness. Yet the taverns flourished. The walls of those excavated at Pompeii are covered in graffiti of astonishing variety. Lewd jokes, snatches of poetry, professions of love, and the inevitable replies of refusal, gambling tallies, election slogans, and the names of the tavern's regulars scrawled in chalk or scratched into plaster with the point of a knife. At a popinae, the common citizen might play at dice, or at the 12-line board game called Duodecim Scripta, an ancestor of backgammon. He might drink a cup of wine warmed with honey and pepper, the calidum. He might listen to a singer with a small lyre, or pay a few asses to watch a juggler perform on a small mat near the door. Prostitution was widespread and largely unregulated, conducted both in dedicated brothels, of which the archaeology of Pompeii preserves a famous example with stone beds in small cubicles, and in the back rooms of taverns and inns. The legal status of prostitutes was low, and the social attitudes of the elite were complex and often hypocritical. But the trade was so common a part of Roman urban life that it produced its own vocabulary, its own festivals, its own small, grim economy. The common citizen who walked home from a tavern in the third hour of the night might pass 3 or 4 women calling softly from doorways before he reached his own block. The theaters and the games of the great public festivals had their own rhythm that intersected with the daily lives of common citizens. On feast days, of which the Roman calendar contained more than 100 each year, the laboring city paused. Shops closed, the streets filled with people in their best tunics. The theaters of Pompey, of Marcellus, of Balbus, all in the Campus Martius, opened their doors, and the long, sloping wooden benches filled with citizens of every class. We know from the seating regulations preserved in the Lex Rossia of 67 before Christ that the first 14 rows of every theater were reserved for the equestrian order. The common citizen sat above, on the steep upper tiers, where the actors below were small, but the great sweeping awning called the velarium provided shade, and a particular cool that the citizens of Rome valued highly. The plays, comedies of Plautus and Terence, mimes of every kind, the late afterpieces of the Aeon farce, were watched in a mood of attentive enjoyment that did not preclude the noisy criticism of bad performances. The gladiatorial games of the great amphitheaters, the Colosseum, completed by Titus in the year 80 after Christ, holds first place in our memory, but smaller amphitheaters existed in nearly every Italian city, were a separate and rarer kind of public event. Common Romans attended them when they could, generally as guests of the emperor or of a wealthy magistrate who had paid for the games out of his own resources. The seating was, as in the theaters, strictly arranged by class. The common citizens sat in the upper tiers. The women sat highest of all in the topmost gallery, where they watched the contests from a great distance through the bright air. The brutal spectacles of the arena were neither universally beloved nor universally condemned. Seneca writes a famous letter denouncing the lunchtime executions he had witnessed in the Colosseum, and the moral discomfort of thoughtful Romans on the subject is amply preserved in literature. By the time the common citizen returned from the theater, or from the tavern, or from a visit to a friend's apartment 2 streets away, the city was deep in the long Roman night. The watchmen had passed 3 or 4 times. The wheeled carts had thinned. The lamps in the upper windows had gone out one by one. Somewhere on the lower slopes of the Palatine, a senator was still dictating to his secretary the letter he intended to dispatch in the morning. Somewhere in the Subura, a midwife was rising at the summons of a neighbor whose labor had begun. Somewhere in the Castra Praetoria on the city's northeastern edge, a soldier walked his portion of the wall in the cold air, counting the hours by the stars. Sleep, for the common Roman, was usually deep but short. The laborer who had risen before dawn had perhaps 6 hours of true darkness in which to rest. He slept on a mattress of straw or wool stuffed into a coarse cloth sack. The wealthy used down or feathers, but for the poor the straw mattress was the standard. He covered himself with a single woolen blanket in winter, with nothing but his tunic in summer. He kept his shoes, the simple leather caligae or the looser, indoor solia, within reach of his hand in case of fire or other alarm. He slept beside his wife if he was married, and often in the same single room with his children, or with an aged parent, or with a slave or 2 if his household had risen to that small dignity. It is in the quiet of these sleeping rooms, the children breathing softly, the wife turning in the straw, the dim red glow of the banked hearth visible through the doorway, that we touch most nearly the inner life of the common Roman. We have very few of his words. The laboring citizens of antiquity did not write memoirs. They did not keep diaries. They left behind tools, kitchen pots, broken combs, oil lamps, the wax tablets on which they reckoned their accounts, the bricks they fired and the walls they built, the bones interred in the modest tombs of the burial collegia along the Aeon way. From these scattered remains, and from the literary glimpses preserved by writers of the upper class, by Pliny, by Martial, by Juvenal, by Tacitus, by Plutarch, by Suetonius, we reconstruct a life of striking ordinariness, of work and meal and bath and sleep, of obligation and pleasure, of patience and grumbling, of small joys and small fears. The evidence suggests that this life, for all its narrowness, was bound together by an intricate web of belonging that the modern city has largely lost. The common Roman was rarely alone. He woke among neighbors, he ate among colleagues, he bathed among acquaintances. He worshipped at street corner shrines with men whose faces he had known since childhood. He was buried in a tomb shared with the other members of his trade guild, whose dues had paid for the stone, and whose representatives stood beside his wife and children as the small bone urn was set into its niche. He moved through the great city as a fish moves through a particular reach of river, knowing every current and eddy, never confused, rarely lost. His religion, too, was woven through the day in ways that the cleaner separations of later ages can scarcely match. He passed the small shrine at his street corner, the compitum, dedicated to the Lares Compitals, the spirits of the crossroads, and made the small gesture of reverence that custom required. He poured a drop of wine on the floor before drinking, an offering to the household gods. He kept a small bunch of dried herbs above his door against the evil eye, a practice older than the Republic and still attested in late antiquity. He attended the great public festivals, the Saturnalia in December, when masters served slaves and the city turned briefly upside down in good-natured chaos. The Lupercalia in February, when young men ran half-naked through the streets striking women with strips of goatskin in a fertility rite whose origins were obscure even to Romans of the Augustan age. The Megalesia, the Cerealia, the Games of Apollo, the festival of Anna Perina by the Tiber on the Ides of March, when the common people picnicked on the riverbank and prayed for as many years of life as they drained cups of wine. The calendar was not a frame around his year. It was the year itself. Of his hopes we know less. We may guess from the inscriptions on common tombs that he hoped for the long life of his children, for the prosperity of his trade, for an honorable name in his collegium, and for the modest dignity of a stone marker over his bones. The inscriptions sometimes name the deceased with a simple formula: to the spirits of the departed, to Lucius Sentius Felix, who lived 35 years, 4 months, and 7 days. His wife and his sons made this. There is in such an inscription, however formulaic, a quiet insistence. I was here, I lived, I was loved, count my days. The common Roman, like the common citizen of every age, asked the world for that much remembrance and was sometimes granted it. His knowledge of the wider empire was patchy and second-hand. He had probably never traveled more than a day's walk from the city of his birth. He knew that grain came from Egypt and Africa, that wine came from Gaul and Spain, that olive oil came from his own Italian hills and from the great groves of Baetica in southern Iberia. He knew the names of the emperors, more or less, and the rough geography of the provinces from the inscriptions on triumphal arches and from the news that came down from the Forum. He knew the great public works of his city, the aqueducts, the basilicas, the colossal baths, the temples, by their inscriptions and by the imperial portraits that adorned them. He was, in his small way, a citizen of a vast and intricate political construction whose scale he could glimpse but not grasp. His health was fragile by our standards. The medical writers of antiquity, Celsus in the 1st century, Galen in the 2nd, provide detailed pictures of the diseases that afflicted the urban population, and the picture is grim. Infectious diseases swept through the crowded Insulae with regularity. Tuberculosis, malaria from the Pontine marshes south of the city, intestinal parasites from contaminated food and water, the chronic eye infections caused by the smoke of olive oil lamps, the dental decay that began in adolescence and rarely ceased, the broken bones of construction laborers and the stab wounds of tavern brawls. All of these were familiar enemies. The doctor was often a Greek slave or freedman of modest training. The surgeon, when one was needed, was a man who had learned his trade in the legionary medical corps. The midwife was a woman of his own neighborhood whose skill had been handed down from her mother or her grandmother. The pharmacist's shop, with its small clay jars of dried herbs and its bronze scales, supplied remedies that ranged from the genuinely effective willow bark, mandrake, garlic, to the merely hopeful. Life expectancy figures for ancient Rome are notoriously difficult to compute, but the evidence suggests that the common citizen who survived the perilous early childhood years could expect to reach somewhere between 40 and 60 years of age, with women on average dying somewhat younger than men because of the dangers of childbirth. Infant mortality, however, was terrible. Perhaps 1 in 3 children died before the age of 1, and perhaps 1 in 2 before the age of 10. The grief of Roman parents at the loss of children is recorded in inscriptions of heart-stopping tenderness and the philosophical literature of the period. The Consolations of Seneca, the Letters of Pliny, treats the loss of a child as one of the great common sorrows of life. We must not imagine, as is sometimes carelessly said, that the Romans were inured to such losses. They mourned as we mourn. They wrote of the children they had lost in terms of unmistakable grief. They simply mourned more often. And so the day closed. The watchmen passed for the last time. The wheeled carts thinned to a final few. The lamps were extinguished. The dogs of the lower city ceased their barking and curled in the doorways. The river slid southwest toward the sea, carrying the day's refuse out toward Ostia, where the great harbor, completed under Claudius and expanded under Trajan, would receive at first light the next convoy of grain ships from Alexandria. The bakers who had risen first were already preparing to rise again. The bread of tomorrow was kneading itself, in a sense, in the slow chemistry of the night-set leavens. And in his small room high under the tiles, the common Roman turned in his straw and dreamed. What he dreamed of we cannot know. The ancients spoke of dreams as messages from the gods, as warnings, as guidance, and at least one writer, Artemidorus of Daldes, whose Onera Critica survives from the 2nd century, left an extensive interpretive manual for them. The common Roman likely interpreted his dreams in the same idiom. The dream of a serpent was a portent of long life. The dream of a falling tooth was an omen of a death in the family. The dream of clear water was a promise of prosperity, of muddy water, of trouble ahead. He woke from these dreams in the same darkness in which he had laid down. He rose to begin the same day again, with its salutatio and its bread and its bath and its bowl of pools. And the cumulative weight of these days, millions of them, lived by millions of Romans through the centuries of the empire, built the city we now study, the city whose marble outlines still rise broken and beautiful above the modern streets that have grown over its bones. We may stand today in the Forum Romanum at dusk, when the last tour groups have drifted away and the swallows are darting low over the brick stumps of basilicas whose names we still know, the Basilica Julia, the Basilica Aemilia, and feel, if we are quiet, the faint pulse of those vanished days. The common Roman walked these stones. He bought his bread here, registered his contracts here, prayed at these temples, gossiped on these steps. His sandals wore grooves in the paving that we can still trace under our fingertips at the right slant of light. He was not a hero. He was not a senator. He was not, in most cases, remembered by name. But he was the city in the deepest sense, its substance, its breath, its working body. To imagine his life is therefore to imagine not the marble surfaces of the empire's monuments, but the texture beneath them. The smell of bread in a baker's lane before sunrise, the weight of a borrowed toga on a client's tired shoulders, the sting of strigil on oiled skin, the warmth of cheap wine in a cracked cup, the breathing of a child in the next room as the lamp gutters at last, and the watchmen pass beneath the window with their lanterns swinging on its iron hook. This is the Rome that no triumphal arch commemorates and no historian wholly captured, but that the satirists glimpsed, that the archaeologists patiently recover, that the wax tablets and the kitchen pots and the worn coins and the rough graffiti scratched into bathhouse walls have preserved for us, fragment by fragment, across the long, quiet centuries. That is where we leave it for tonight. The lanterns are dimming. Sleep well, and we will meet in the next age.